Welcome back. I'm David Wilkinson, the editor of the Oxford Review, and today we've got Kare Letrud, who's done some really interesting papers around scientific myths and how they manage to kind of grow and invade scientific thinking and papers. So welcome, Kare. Do you just want to start off by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and a bit of your kind of journey and background that's kind of led you to this place in terms of the research?
Yeah, I'm an assistant professor at the Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences, campus Lillehammer. Here I mainly teach a course called Examen Philosophicum, which is a 10 ECTS introductory course in philosophy of science and critical thinking. It's kind of a compulsory part of several bachelor degrees. And I quite recently, a couple of months ago, I defended my thesis at the University of Bergen in philosophy of science. This doctorate is not strictly a PhD. It's called a Doctor Philosophy, and it's kind of an independent study without a supervisor, and I'm not part of any PhD program. So I informally refer to it as a DIY PhD, really.
It's a PhD, and the research is good. I've read it.
Thanks. So so this thesis was about scientific myths, and particularly the learning pyramid, which is kind of very central, my main example of scientific myth in those discussions.
Yes, yeah, and congratulations on your defense of the thesis. As I say, I've read the thesis. It's very good, very interesting. So, you know, you've kind of, over the last few years, kind of since 2012, from what I can gather, is you've published a series of papers around kind of scientific myths and how they've kind of pervaded some scientific thinking, but other people's thinking as well. And the first one that I picked up on, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, was the paper that's entitled "A Rebuttal of NTL's Institute's Learning Pyramid." But also the ones that followed on from there, the affirmative citation bias and scientific myth debunking, a 3-in-1 case study, excavating the origins of learning pyramid myths, and then obviously your thesis that you were talking about. So do you just want to give us an overview of what kind of led to this stream of research?
Yeah, the project goes way back, really, maybe 12 years. It started when the local chief librarian Sigbjørn Hernes and I were presented with this learning pyramid model. And we found it's strange. There were many weird things about it. Like, it seems like you remembered maybe 10%, 20% if you attended a lecture. But if you watch the same lecture on videotape, you apparently remember 40, 50% of the same material. And that's kind of, it didn't seem quite consistent. And the numbers were too even. It was kind of strange, but it seemed to be accepted knowledge. So at first we, okay, maybe it's so. And it kind of corresponded to how we thought about teaching. And we were kind of frustrated doing lectures. How much do you actually remember from this? And so, okay, maybe this is so. But we started to investigate. And this was about 2008, 2008. And we started to investigate this learning pyramid. And we didn't find any research about it. So, and what we did find was that several used them, and some criticized it. And we made we published a paper in 2009 in a Norwegian publication, where we kind of just did a review about what do we know about these learning pyramids and how often are they, or how common are they in the Norwegian literature on education. So that was kind of just, this is what we know, this is how common it is. And Sigbjørn and I, we had a very good collaboration, and we proceeded to work with this issue. And we kind of increased the range of it. So we started looking at the international diffusion of this model. So, that was in 2016. We published a paper in the Journal Curriculum Studies. We reported 418 peer-reviewed journals publishing some version of the learning pyramid. And now consider that there is maybe 70 million papers published by now. 418 doesn't sound that impressive, really. It is too many, but not dramatically, I would say. But what we consider maybe more important is that also several field-specific encyclopedia articles featured some version of the learning pyramid. And when knowledge gain this kind of level in publication, when they come into the encyclopedias, they are like, this is consensus. This is what we know about these things. And this paper took some time. It took several years to publish, or to write and to get it published, because this learning pyramid it's just basically a blanket term. It's an umbrella term for a lot of different models, and some of them don't really look like each other. So we had to establish the history and kind of genealogy of the learning pyramid to be able to say, this is a version of the pyramid, this is a version of it, and that is not. So this was a very complex, this time-consuming piece of work, and a lot of time went into that. And following that, we kind of worked on we carried this kind of genealogy, is historical perspective, yes. A bit further, and doing kind of this archaeology, we dug our way back to also looking for the origin of this learning pyramids. Also was a quest to find what research was there available that could support its model. So we kind of dug our way back and back and back, and the model seems to change consequently, and we ended up in the 1850s. Oh. That's where we found the first identifiable version of the learning pyramid. And from what we can gather, that is not the first one. Or sometimes maybe late 1850s, they were talking about this as common knowledge, as this is what we used to say, this is common expression, this is, yeah. So it is probably decades older than 1850. But from there, we weren't able to get hold of any more digitized papers, so we had to kind of just put stop there. But for us, it was adequate, because we could now say that there is no scientific basis for the learning pyramids, because simply psychologists started studying retention decades later. So if the learning pyramid was somehow based on research, we would have to rewrite the entire history of psychology, basically. So we were content that, okay, there is no research for this. So that was the first finding, that we can establish that this was basically folk psychology hearsay, or what do you call there's an expression, a saying, yeah. And that's the one finding. And the other finding is the quite paradoxical discovery that this model is actually 160 years old. And we have found it in academic publishing, or inside academic publishing and outside for all these years. And usually science or research is able to remove false or unsubstantiated claims. But of course, this would take some time, at least 160 years. That seems a bit much. So from primarily the 2016 and 2018 papers, I wrote, I used these two papers as a kind of case to try to develop some kind of conceptual theoretical work on top of this, and to use the learning pyramid case as a case of a scientific myth, and try to develop a kind of a concept and scientific myth concept and some explanation as to how scientific myths persist, how they diffuse, how they persist, debunking, etc. So that kind of ended up being my thesis, basically.
Yeah, yeah. We'll come back to that in a second. Let me, the story of how I came across you actually is kind of paradoxical to all of this. I was actually, so my master's and doctorate are in education, so do a lot of work around learning, obviously, and the whole thing around expert and novice learners and how they learn differently, and various other bits and pieces like that. So I actually happened to be reading a study. I don't know whether you can hear that. It's rain. It's amazing. We've had a lot of thunder and lightning. So I was reading a paper that was published this year called Developing Management Effectiveness. I don't know why academics use this kind of language. The nexus between teaching and coaching, right? So in there, they reference your work, right? And they reference the paper, the rebuttal of NTL's Institute's Learning Pyramid paper that you published some time ago, right? But they use that paper as evidence to support the learning pyramid, saying that you have scientifically proved the pyramid. And I was like, what? This is exactly the opposite of what this guy's saying. I hadn't met you at that point. And I was thinking, how can they actually publish this? And I'm still a bit stunned about it, like that they would actually do that. I don't know what have you seen that paper?
I was aware. It is not often cited. That this paper is not often cited, and by the time I checked it, I kind of assumed that it would be citing it incorrectly.
Oh,
yeah, it is. It is definitely not uncommon.
it's amazing. So,
Yeah.
so can you just? What I'm interested in really is, kind of what thoughts you're coming up with is how come these myths not only kind of pervade scientific thinking, but actually get to a stage where people are using it in the completely opposite direction. So they're using other people's research in a completely opposite direction than it was actually intended for. I don't understand how that can happen.
I think the most easiest explanation is that they haven't read the paper. That is my guess. Yeah. It is quite clear on how I feel about the learning pyramid, so I don't think it's ambiguous in any way. So that's kind of the first part of the explanation. Perhaps they haven't read it, and more interesting is perhaps asking, so why didn't they read it? And there's several plausible explanations for that. And one thing is that the learning pyramids and several of all the myths that I have looked at are kind of intuitive. They kind of sound right. They're truthy. They kind of agree with our experience, our informal experience. We can easily think of several examples of how this is correct. Like the idea of the learning pyramid that you learn more efficiently by teaching others. Of course, when I stand teaching, for instance, the cave metaphor of Plato, and suddenly I have a realization that, okay, this is probably what he meant. As I stand there, I get this kind of epiphany. And when I look back at how I have worked with Plato, how I've studied Plato, and how I taught him, this epiphany stands out more clear to me in my memory than all tedious work reading this old English, this bad Norwegian or English translations, or trying to get grips with the Greek, or
Yeah, all the
all this
lectures you've
work.
been
Yeah,
to.
all the lectures I've followed myself, all these are kind of, they're way back, they aren't memorable, but this epiphany is, so it kind of easily lends itself to this narrative that, okay, this is how it works. So, and this is one thing. And also the learning pyramid is very malleable. It's plastic. It is kind of, you can shape it any way you like. So if your preference is doing digital teaching, if you're into MOOCs, if you're into using iPads, there's always room to put in these things somewhere high up the hierarchy in the learning pyramid. If you think that practicing, if you think that discussion groups are essential, these also can be stressed in the model. I remember we joked about, I don't remember, I'm not sure if you had this in English, but in Sunday schools in the olden days, they had this kind of flannelograph. It's kind of fabrics with figures that you put on a flat surface.
Yes.
To tell biblical stories. I mean, you kind of joke, okay, these people are using this model to argue for the efficiency of specific technologies. We could even find an example of flannelograph, and they actually did that. They put the flannelograph into the version of the learning pyramid. So whatever idea you want to present, you can use the learning pyramid to do that.
So it's kind of a confirmation bias, and the learning pyramid's ambiguous enough to allow for that to occur.
It is. And several of, it kind of corresponds also to ideas about activating students. Of course, these are healthy ideas, but they are quite diffuse, quite vague, and they kind of speak to all these ideas about how we ought to teach in some way. And okay, so those kind of explanations goes about the particularities of the learning pyramid and similar myths. And there's also other reasons, like you don't have time, you're stressed, you need to publish things, okay. And also there can be minor breaches, like I think I have read this paper. I do believe I read this paper, but I actually didn't. And my EndNote base has 3,000 papers. And it's very easily to imagine that I have read it and I know what's in that paper, so I don't have to read it again. But actually, I've just put it in my EndNote and I haven't actually read it. So that is very easily done, actually.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah, fallibility of memory, definitely.
So you make about hundreds of claims if you publish several papers, you make hundreds of claims, you make hundreds of references, hundreds of citations, and okay, errors are bound to happen. And when these small errors accumulate, you kind of get this phenomena, these scientific myths.
Yes, and it's largely because the information is coming at us from lots of different places.
Yeah.
And if we don't engage, and it's what you're talking about, what you're teaching, if you don't engage in critical thinking and start going, hang on a minute, so a video of the lecture is more impactful than the lecture and has greater retention. How can that be? When you start to think like that, then it starts to unravel.
Yeah.
Definitely. And that's based on a whole series of other knowledge constructs and things like that. Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the problems with all of this is that, you know, it can erode people's faith in science when people start to realize that these things actually aren't based on anything. And you know, I did a thing on LinkedIn yesterday about kind of these neuromyths that pervade a lot of people's thinking, you know, around kind of hemispherical dominance, this idea of a right and left brain, and you know, being more logical and more creative. You know, it's just not true. But it's spawned a whole industry just about, and it kind of catches people's imagination, I think. So are there any other findings from your research about why these things end up being disseminated so widely?
Well, there's a paper in my thesis that is not yet published. I need to work on it a bit further, but I kind of identify minor epistemic breaches, minor epistemic flaws, like they sometimes read critics. They refer to critic, but they sometimes don't engage with it. They kind of just, but this idea is controversial, and they leave it there. They don't engage with the debate itself. So they kind of just go through the emotions, like, here's the learning pyramid, it says so and so. It is controversial, but it seems to accord with how we think, and also it is very commonly used. So they kind of just take it up, lift it up, show it, and put it aside as an issue. And there's several problems around citations. Yeah, just basically, I tried to make a kind of list of this kind of small breaches of acceptable research practices.
Mm. And they all act as kind of cognitive nudges. And that, again, that I think what you're talking about the lack of engagement is a lack of critical thinking. It's that because it takes effort to critically think.
Yeah,
you know,
and it's quite kind of easy also to consider, okay, this model is widely published, so it is authoritative. Who am I to question all these researchers? There are hundreds of researchers publishing models. How can they be wrong? Yeah. So maybe I also lack of confidence to say, hang on a minute.
Yes, I've got a voice in this.
Yeah.
And yes, and I think a lack of confidence, particularly with people, if you see professors and esteemed academics publishing, it can be quite intimidating, particularly if you're just starting out, a PhD student or somebody who's not even an academic and they read it. It's got to be true. And that, I think that gets going. There was an interesting, and I think this also has something to do with this. There was a paper that I was reading late last year that was looking at the lag between research being published and it actually getting into practice. So the original paper I was looking at was actually looking at the lag in clinical practice in medicine. And they say on average, it takes about 17 years for things in research to end up in practice in hospitals and medicine, things like that. There was another one published about MBAs showing that it takes about 13 years from publication to ideas from the publication ending up on MBA programs. So there's this kind of lag. And what's interesting is what happens in that lag, how all of these, what is it that creates the conditions where those pieces of research are published, because there's an enormous amount of publication going on. I estimate roughly about 105,000 papers published every month, new papers every month, which is, I know, it's incredible. And but what's happening in that time period, and what's creating the conditions where individuals become conscious of a stream of thinking, a stream of research, in order to then bring it into practice. And I think that's part of the whole kind of idea of little nudges, little things that are kind of accumulating over time. And I think that's one of the reasons why we get this huge lag, because some of the research actually takes quite a mind shift. You've really got to go, hang on a minute, I've now got to reconsider everything here. Yeah. Rather than it just kind of fitting in a stream of kind of thinking. And I think that could be part of the story as well, which is interesting. So yeah, go on.
There's probably some kind of also institutional hinders to this, because they have to find the way into textbooks, they have to find their way into curricula, they have to find it to, So, and by the time these students get to their workplaces, there are established cultures that they will have to fight. So I guess I'm not surprised that 17 years is the time.
Yeah,
to describe. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. No, I'm not either. What I'm particularly interested in is what goes on in people's heads over that period of time to make it acceptable or to make it important or whatever happens to be. So, if you were to pull out a takeaway or a couple of takeaways for practitioners from this who will be listening to this, so people in organizations and things like that, about scientific research, what would they be?
I guess be aware of simplistic answers to complex questions and sweeping generalizations of human behavior. Because if you find an idea intuitive, neat, and comes very easily to mind, chances are they have also come very easily to the mind of the researchers. So if maybe that is kind of a general rule of thumb I can give, because the myths I have been looked at are this kind of very general, kind of vague descriptions of human behavior without consideration of context of social context or time of personalities, culture, or anything. This kind of one size fits all intuitive, clear idea about how people work, how they function, how we learn, how we behave, how we respond. So yeah, these kind of ideas.
Yes.
I guess that would be the most relevant for the practitioners, at least.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Definitely. Okay. Thank you very much, Kare. I really appreciate your time
Thank you.
and the work that you're doing. I think it's really important work. Is there some way that if people want to kind of follow you, follow your research, or contact you, that they can?
Yes, they can contact me via email. And
I'll put that on the website. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't have a huge presence on the internet, but I have a ResearchGate page. So, and some of my papers are available there, and if they contact me via ResearchGate, I can send them copies, or via email, of course.
Yeah, we'll put your link to the ResearchGate profile for you.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Kare. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Really nice making contact with you at last. Great. Take care and good luck for for the new term with
Thank you.
the teaching with all of the issues that we're facing with coronavirus, and hopefully we'll talk again some other time.
Yeah, maybe.
You take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care. Bye bye.